A ballistic missile launched from Iranian territory just tore across hundreds of miles of airspace over Iraq, then Syria, and kept going north until it entered the sovereign airspace of Turkey, a NATO member state, a country that sits under the full protection of the most powerful military alliance in the history of the world. NATO air defense systems engaged the projectile and reportedly destroyed it before it could reach its final destination. But here's the part that should stop you cold. When analysts traced the trajectory of that missile forward, when they mapped where it was heading before it was intercepted, the flight path pointed directly toward one of the most sensitive and heavily guarded military installations on the face of the Earth. Incirlik Air Base, a facility where American military forces operate around the clock and where, according to decades of credible reporting from nuclear security analysts and organizations like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the United States stores approximately 50 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs under NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement. A missile from Iran did not just fly in the general direction of a NATO country. It flew toward a base where American nuclear weapons sit in underground vaults, and it got close enough that debris from the intercept reportedly scattered across areas of southern Turkey near Hatay province before raining down on the landscape below. This is not a regional skirmish anymore. This is something entirely different, and the implications of what almost happened are so enormous that if you do not fully understand them by the end of this video, you will not understand anything else that follows in the weeks and months ahead. If you are watching this channel for the first time, this is War and Wealth, and this is exactly what we do here. We take the stories that the mainstream media either buries in a 30-second segment or fails to explain properly, and we break them all the way down so you walk away actually understanding what is happening and why it matters. If that sounds like the kind of content you have been looking for, subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell, because the events unfolding in this part of the world are moving fast, and what comes next could reshape the global order in ways that affect every single one of us. Now, let us get into the full picture of what happened, starting with the flight path itself, because the geography of this event tells a story that is almost as alarming as the event itself. Iran sits on the eastern side of the Middle East, bordered to the west by Iraq. For a missile launched from Iranian territory to reach Turkey, it has to cross the entirety of Iraqi airspace, which spans roughly 500 miles depending on the launch point and trajectory. After clearing Iraq, the missile then entered Syrian airspace, crossing over a country that is already engulfed in its own complex web of military activity involving Russian forces, remnants of various armed groups, and ongoing instability. From Syria, the missile continued northwest until it crossed into Turkish airspace and was engaged by NATO defense systems. The total flight distance from launch to intercept likely covered somewhere in the range of 700 to 1,000 al-mi, depending on the specific launch site and the trajectory the missile followed. That is an enormous distance, and every single mile of that flight path crossed over countries that are either allied with the United States, host American military personnel, or are deeply intertwined with NATO and Western security interests. The fact that this missile was able to traverse that entire distance before being intercepted raises immediate and critical questions about detection, tracking, and the time available for response. Ballistic missiles, particularly medium-range ballistic missiles of the type Iran is known to possess, travel at extreme velocities during their terminal phase. We are talking about speeds that can exceed Mach 5, which is more than 3,800 mph. At those speeds, the window between detection and required intercept is measured in minutes, sometimes just seconds. In the final phase, NATO operates a layered sensor network that includes ground-based radars, satellite-based early warning systems, and airborne surveillance platforms. The fact that the missile was detected and successfully intercepted before reaching its apparent target is a testament to the capability of those systems. but the fact that it got as far as it did and as close as it did before being destroyed is a reminder that no defense system operates with infinite margin for error. Let us talk about what was reportedly at the end of that flight path, because this is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary in its implications. Incirlik Air Base sits in Adana province in southern Turkey, not far from the Mediterranean coast. It has been a cornerstone of American and NATO military operations in the region for over 6 decades since the height of the Cold War. The base hosts the 39th Air Base Wing of the United States Air Force and has been used as a staging point for operations ranging from surveillance flights during the Cold War to combat operations during the Gulf War, the Iraq War, and the campaign against ISIS. It is one of the most strategically important military installations in the entire NATO alliance. But in most significant and most sensitive role is one that has been discussed extensively by nuclear security researchers and policy analysts for decades. Even though the United States government has never officially confirmed the specific details, under NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement, the United States deploys B-61 nuclear gravity bombs at several bases across Europe. According to assessments by the Federation of American Scientists, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, among others, Incirlik Air Base is one of those storage locations. The estimated number of weapons stored there has varied over the years as the US has consolidated and reduced its European nuclear stockpile, but credible estimates from these organizations have consistently placed the number at approximately 50 B-61 bombs. These are tactical nuclear weapons smaller than the massive strategic warheads mounted on intercontinental ballistic missiles, but still extraordinarily powerful. A single B-61, depending on its configuration, can have a yield ranging from a fraction of a kiloton up to approximately 400 kilotons. For reference, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima had a yield of roughly 15 kilotons. Even at the lower end of the B-61's yield range, these are devastating weapons of enormous destructive power. The weapons are stored in underground vaults within specially constructed protective aircraft shelters. They are guarded by dedicated security forces and protected by multiple layers of physical security, electronic surveillance, and access control systems. The storage and handling procedures are governed by some of the most stringent protocols in the entire American military. These are not weapons that can be accidentally detonated by a conventional missile strike. They are designed with multiple safety mechanisms, including insensitive high explosives, strong link and weak link systems, and other features specifically engineered to prevent nuclear detonation in the event of fire, impact, or other extreme conditions. So the concern is not that an Iranian missile could have triggered a nuclear explosion at Incirlik. That scenario, while terrifying to contemplate, is essentially impossible given the design of modern American nuclear weapons. The real concerns are different, but arguably just as serious. First, there's the concern about radiological contamination. If a conventional warhead were to strike a nuclear weapons storage site with enough force to breach the vaults and damage the weapons inside, the conventional explosives and nuclear materials within the bombs could be scattered, potentially creating a radiological dispersal event. This would not produce a nuclear detonation, but it could spread radioactive material across a significant area, creating a contamination zone that would require extensive and expensive cleanup and could render portions of a critical military base unusable for an extended period. Second, there is the concern about the symbolic and strategic magnitude of such a strike. A missile hitting a facility where American nuclear weapons are stored, even without causing a nuclear event, would be an attack on the most sensitive category of military assets that exists. It would represent a crossing of a line that has never been crossed in the entire history of the nuclear age. The psychological, political, and strategic shockwaves would be incalculable. And that brings us to what is perhaps the most consequential question arising from this entire incident. Does a missile fired by Iran that enters Turkish airspace and is intercepted over Turkish territory constitute an armed attack on a NATO member state? And if it does that trigger Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty? Article 5 is the Collective Defense Clause, the single most important provision in the entire NATO framework. It states that an armed attack against one or more of the member states in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and that each member state will take such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Article 5 has been invoked exactly once in NATO's 75-year history, and that was on September 12, 2001, the day after the terrorist attacks on the United States. It has never been invoked in response to a state-on-state military attack. If Turkey were to formally request consultations under Article 4 of the treaty, which allows any member state to bring an issue to the table when it believes its territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened, that alone would set in motion a diplomatic and military process of enormous significance. And if Turkey or any other member were to push for an Article 5 determination, the consequences would be almost beyond calculation. You would potentially be looking at a scenario where 31 NATO member nations, including the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and every other member of the alliance, are formally committed to responding to an Iranian attack on a fellow member's territory. That does not necessarily mean an immediate, full-scale military response. Article 5 gives each member state discretion in how it responds, but it creates a political and legal framework that makes escalation not just possible, but structurally encouraged. Now, it is important to understand that invoking Article 5 is a political decision as much as it is a legal or military one. NATO operates by consensus. Every member state would need to agree that the threshold for collective defense has been met. And there are significant political complexities at play. Turkey's relationship with the rest of NATO has been strained at various points in recent years over issues ranging from Turkey's purchase of Russian S-400 missile defense systems to disagreements over policy in Syria and the Eastern Mediterranean. Some NATO members might be reluctant to support an Article 5 invocation if they believe it could draw the entire alliance into a broader Middle Eastern war. Others might argue that failing to respond decisively to a missile attack on a member's territory would fatally undermine the credibility of the alliance's core commitment. These are not easy calculations, and the internal debates within NATO over how to respond to this incident are likely to be intense and deeply consequential. But here is the reality that transcends any internal NATO debate. Regardless of whether Article 5 is formally invoked, the fact that an Iranian ballistic missile entered NATO airspace and was heading toward a base housing American nuclear weapons fundamentally changes the character of this conflict. Until this moment, the confrontation between Iran and its adversaries, as serious and dangerous as it has been, could still be characterized primarily as a regional conflict. It involved Iran, Israel, various proxy groups, and American forces operating in a supporting and defensive role. That framing is no longer adequate. When a ballistic missile from a non-NATO state crosses into NATO territory and threatens one of the alliance's most sensitive installations, the conflict has expanded beyond the Middle East in the most direct and undeniable way possible. It does not matter whether Iran intended to hit Incirlik specifically, or whether the missile went off course or was aimed at another target and deviated. What matters is where it went and what was underneath it when it was finally destroyed. Let us consider what this means from Iran's perspective, because understanding the other side of this equation is essential to grasping the full scope of the danger. Iran has been under enormous military pressure. Its nuclear facilities have been discussed as potential targets for years. Its military commanders have been killed in targeted strikes. Its proxy networks across the region have suffered significant losses. In that context, Iran's missile program represents its most important strategic deterrent, the one capability that allows it to threaten meaningful retaliation against adversaries who possess overwhelming advantages in air power, naval power, and conventional military technology. Iran's missile arsenal includes systems like the Shahab-3, which has a range of approximately 12,200 miles, the EMA precision-guided variant, the solid-fueled Sajil with a similar range, and newer systems like the K-Ba'ar Sheen in the Feta series. These missiles give Iran the ability to strike targets across the entire Middle East and into southeastern Europe, which means that NATO territory in Turkey has always been within range. The question that every strategist in Washington, Ankara, Brussels, and every other NATO capital is now grappling with is whether this incident represents a deliberate test by Iran of NATO's willingness to respond, an accidental overshoot from a strike aimed at targets in Syria or elsewhere, or the opening move in a broader strategy to demonstrate that Iran can threaten NATO directly and thereby raise the costs of any further military action against it. Each of those possibilities carries its own set of terrifying implications. If it was deliberate, then Iran is signaling a willingness to escalate far beyond anything it has done before, directly challenging the most powerful military alliance in history. If it was accidental, then Iran's command and control over its missile forces may be less precise than assumed, which introduces the risk of unintended escalation through miscalculation, arguably an even more dangerous scenario in some ways. And if it is the opening of a broader strategy, then NATO needs to prepare for the possibility that this will not be the last time an Iranian missile enters its airspace. The United States has several military assets in the region specifically designed to detect and defend against ballistic missile threats. The ENTPY-2 radar deployed at Kurachik in Turkey is part of NATO's ballistic missile defense architecture and provides early warning and tracking capability against missile launches from the east. Aegis-equipped destroyers and cruisers operating in the eastern Mediterranean carry SM-3 interceptors capable of engaging ballistic missiles in their mid-course phase, and Patriot missile batteries, including PAC-3 systems, are deployed at various locations throughout the region to provide terminal phase defense. These systems collectively provide multiple layers of defense, and in this incident, they appear to have functioned as design detecting and destroying the incoming threat before it reached its target. But the system was tested, and the margin between success and catastrophe was far narrower than anyone should be comfortable with. There is another dimension to this story that deserves serious attention, and that is the impact on the broader question of nuclear weapons deployment in Europe. The presence of American nuclear weapons at Incirlik and at other bases across Europe has been debated within NATO for years. Some member states and many arms control advocates have argued that these weapons are Cold War relics that no longer serve a meaningful strategic purpose, and that their presence in politically unstable regions creates more risk than it mitigates. This incident dramatically amplifies that argument. If a base storing American nuclear weapons can be targeted, however inadvertently, by a ballistic missile from a regional adversary, then the question of whether those weapons should remain at that location takes on an urgency it has never had before. At the same time, removing those weapons could be seen as a retreat, as NATO backing down in the face of Iranian pressure, which could embolden not just Iran, but other adversaries as well. It is a dilemma with no clean answer. The diplomatic fallout from this incident is also going to be significant and far-reaching. Turkey is in a unique position within NATO, serving as the alliance's southeastern anchor and the only member state that shares a broad geographic proximity to Iran and the Middle East conflict zones. Turkey also maintains its own complex and sometimes contradictory relationships with multiple parties in the region. How Ankara chooses to respond, whether it pushes for a strong collective NATO response, handles the matter bilaterally with Iran, or seeks to use the incident as leverage in its broader diplomatic relationships, will shape the trajectory of this crisis in profound ways. And every other NATO member is watching Turkey's response just as carefully as they are watching Iran's next move. For the American public, this incident should be a clarifying moment. The idea that conflicts in the Middle East are distant events that do not directly affect American security interests has always been somewhat misleading, but now it is demonstrably false. American nuclear weapons were in the potential blast radius of a ballistic missile fired by a nation that the United States has been in an adversarial relationship with for over 4 decades. American service members were stationed at the base that missile was heading toward. The defense systems that intercepted that missile were American-built and partially American-operated. This is not someone else's problem. This is directly, immediately, and undeniably an American problem. Looking forward, the critical question is what happens next. If Iran fires another missile that enters NATO airspace, the pressure to invoke Article 5 will increase dramatically, and the range of possible responses escalates accordingly. If Iran refrains from further provocations in NATO territory, there may be space for diplomatic de-escalation, but the precedent has been set and cannot be unset. The world now knows that Iranian missiles can reach NATO territory, that they have reached NATO territory, and that they came within interceptable but still uncomfortably close distance of one of the most sensitive military installations on the planet. The defense establishment in Washington is undoubtedly already conducting an exhaustive review of the protective measures at Incirlik and at every other facility in the region where sensitive American assets are deployed. Questions about hardening, dispersal, additional air defense layers, and even the potential relocation of certain assets are all on the table. The Missile Defense Agency, U.S. European Command, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff are all going to be involved in reassessing force posture and defense readiness in light of what just happened. And Congress is going to have questions, a lot of questions, about how this was allowed to happen, about what the intelligence community knew about the threat, about whether existing defense systems are sufficient, and about what additional resources need to be allocated to ensure it does not happen again. This is one of those moments in geopolitics where the world quietly shifts on its axis. No official declarations of war, no dramatic speeches on the floor of the United Nations, just a missile, a flight path, an intercept, and the sudden visceral realization among every decision-maker in every capital that matters that the rules have changed. The boundaries that were assumed to be inviolable have been tested. The systems that were assumed to be sufficient have been stressed, and the escalatory dynamics that everyone has been trying to manage have just taken a significant and dangerous leap forward. That is the reality of where we stand right now. And if you have made it this far in this video, you are exactly the kind of person who belongs in this community. War and wealth exists for people who want to understand the forces that are actually shaping the world, not the sanitized version that gets delivered in a 90-con news segment, but the full, unfiltered, deeply researched analysis that gives you genuine understanding. So here's what I need from you right now. First, drop a comment below and tell me what you think should happen next. Should NATO invoke Article 5? Should the United States relocate its nuclear weapons from Incirlik? Is this the moment that drags NATO into a direct confrontation with Iran? I want to hear your perspective because the discussions in this comment section are consistently some of the most thoughtful and well-informed conversations anywhere on this platform, and your input genuinely matters. Second, share this video right now. Send it to a friend who needs to understand what just happened. Post it in a group chat, put it on your social media. This is the kind of information that people need to have, and most of them are not getting it from anywhere else. And if you have not already subscribed to War and Wealth, do it right now and hit that bell so you are here for every single video that follows this one, because this story is not over, not even close. I will see you in the next